Forgive them? No, not because you're bitter, but because forgiveness doesn't mean restoring access, and what they did disqualified them from ever touching your life again. They expected mercy to look like memory loss. They thought time would erase accountability, but time didn't erase anything. It exposed everything. Their hell isn't fire or chaos. It's watching you move on untouched while they carry the weight of what they broke. They thought forgiveness meant comfort. Instead, they got consequences wrapped in silence. They will see hell in the way doors close quietly in front of them, in how your absence becomes permanent, in how nothing feels the same once you're gone. They thought apologies could undo behavior. They learned too late that apologies don't reverse damage, they only highlight it. Their hell is realizing you healed without them, that you didn't need closure from the people who caused the wound. They expected anger so they could argue it away. What they got was indifference, and indifference starves ego. They will see hell every time they try to explain their side and realize no one is listening anymore. They thought they could return once things cooled down. They didn't understand that cold decisions don't reheat. Their hell is watching you succeed without bitterness, no revenge, no noise, just distance and growth. They assumed forgiveness meant access. You taught them forgiveness can coexist with permanent removal. They will feel it in moments they can't fix, in memories they can't revisit, in doors that no longer open. They thought time would soften you. Time sharpened your boundaries instead. Their hell is knowing they lost you not because of one mistake, but because of a pattern they refused to change. They expected your heart to stay open forever. They didn't realize hearts close when they're disrespected long enough. They will see hell in how calm you are now. Calm after chaos is terrifying to those who caused the storm. They thought you'd forgive and forget. You forgave yourself for staying too long and never forgot the lesson. Their hell is realizing you're no longer emotionally available to be hurt by them. They thought they mattered more than your peace. They were wrong. They will feel it when they try to recreate you and others and fail every time. Their hell is comparison. Every connection after you will remind them of what they lost. They expected a dramatic ending. What they got was a quiet one, and quiet endings are permanent. They thought they could walk back in later. They didn't realize you changed the locks internally. Their hell is seeing you thrive without needing to prove anything. They assumed forgiveness meant you'd still care. But caring ended when respect disappeared. They will see hell in the form of regret that arrives too late to matter. They thought you'd carry resentment. You carried discipline instead. Their hell is understanding that you didn't destroy them, you simply removed yourself. They will feel it in the absence of your loyalty, your effort, your presence. They thought you were replaceable. Time will prove otherwise. Their hell is knowing they can't undo what they did, and you won't pretend it didn't happen. They expected softness after damage. You chose strength. They will see hell every time they remember how easily you walked away once clarity arrived. They thought forgiveness meant resetting the clock. You ended the entire chapter. Their hell is realizing they didn't lose you angrily, they lost you intelligently. They assumed you'd always be there. You proved always ends when disrespect becomes familiar. They will live with the knowledge that you didn't curse them. You didn't fight them. You didn't seek revenge. You simply left. And that absence became the consequence they can never escape. Their hell will begin the moment they realize forgiveness was never the goal. Growth was, and growth doesn't look back to rescue people who chose to harm. They will feel it in the silence where your presence used to soften everything. Silence has a way of amplifying regret when there's nothing left to distract from it. They thought forgiveness would mean relief. Instead, they got awareness, the slow, crushing understanding of what they lost. Their hell will be watching you live freely without carrying bitterness. Nothing hurts worse than knowing you didn't destroy yourself over them. They expected time to blur their mistakes. But time sharpened them, turning memories into permanent reminders. They will feel it when their name no longer has power over your emotions. When their existence becomes neutral, irrelevant, small, their hell is realizing you don't even need to dislike them anymore. Dislike still means engagement. You moved beyond that. They thought you would soften once the pain faded. They didn't realize pain didn't harden you, clarity did. They will see hell in the way you no longer explain yourself. No defenses, no justifications, just distance. They assumed forgiveness meant re-entry, but forgiveness only released you, not them. Their hell is the loss of access to your energy, your loyalty, your protection, things they took for granted until they vanished. They will feel it in moments where they wish they could reach out and realize they can't. They thought remorse would save them. They didn't understand remorse without change is meaningless. Their hell is knowing you didn't need them to heal. You healed by removing the source. They will see it when others don't tolerate what you once endured. That comparison will haunt them. They expected you to stay emotionally available. You chose emotional sovereignty instead. Their hell is watching you trust again, just not them. They thought forgiveness meant forgetting. You remembered enough to never repeat the mistake. They will feel it when they realize you're not angry anymore. Anger still gives people importance. Indifference does not. Their hell is knowing you didn't lose yourself, you found yourself the moment you walked away. They expected consequences to look dramatic. They didn't expect them to look permanent. They will see it in the calm way you move now. Calm is what remains after you stop fighting battles that aren't worth it. They thought they could live with what they did. They didn't realize memory has weight. Their hell is understanding that you didn't punish them, life adjusted accordingly once you stepped out of the way. They assumed forgiveness was something they were entitled to. You showed them forgiveness is personal, not transactional. They will live knowing the version of you they had access to no longer exists because they helped destroy it. Their hell begins with the silence you never break. No messages, no explanations, no emotional leftovers. Just absence doing its quiet work. Absence that answers everything. They will feel it when they realize forgiveness wasn't denied. Access was. Energy was. Time was. And those things never return once revoked. That loss hits slower but deeper. Their hell shows up when they finally mature. When awareness arrives late. When growth hurts instead of heals. When they understand what they mishandled and realize you are no longer available. That timing will crush them. They will feel it when your name no longer reacts inside them. No anger, no warmth, no longing. Just neutrality. Neutrality is devastating to ego. Their hell lives in comparison. Every new connection falls short. Every bond feels thinner. Every loyalty feels forced. Because they once had depth and chose to waste it. They will notice it when you stop being part of their story. No references. No mentions. No memories shared. You exit the narrative completely, and erasure hurts more than blame. Their hell arrives when apologies feel useless, because there's no audience left, no door to knock on, no chance to redeem, no stage for regret, just accountability with nowhere to go. They will feel it in moments of loneliness, when distractions fail, when silence grows heavy, when reflection becomes unavoidable, and your absence becomes undeniable. That's when it settles in. Their hell is watching you forgive internally, not for them, but for yourself, because that freedom removes leverage and leaves them powerless. Powerlessness terrifies manipulators. They will notice it when you no longer flinch. No reactions, no emotional hooks, no triggers. You've healed past reach. That distance burns quietly. Their hell is realizing you didn't win by hurting them. You won by disengaging, by choosing peace, by choosing growth, by choosing finality. Finality has weight. They will feel it when you succeed without explanation. No announcements, no justifications, no need for validation. Your progress speaks alone, and it speaks loudly. Their hell is knowing you didn't become cold randomly. You became selective, intentional, protective, and they taught you how. That truth stings. They will feel it when they understand this wasn't punishment. It was consequence. Natural, earned, unavoidable, and permanent. Their hell ends where yours begins. With peace, with clarity, with boundaries intact. You moved forward clean and left them behind with the lesson. They were ready for chaos, for tears, for questions that would keep them relevant. They wanted you to demand explanations, to unravel in confusion, to give them the satisfaction of being the center of your emotional storm. Instead, you gave them nothing but a quiet pivot forward. They wanted to scream why, because why keeps a door open. It creates space for excuses, justifications, and emotional bargaining. But you didn't ask. You didn't pause. You moved on like the answer no longer mattered. They expected a reaction that would prove they still mattered. Raised voices, shaking hands, late-night messages. But you skipped all of that and whispered next, like they were already behind you. They weren't prepared for how quickly you detached. One moment they thought they were significant, the next they were irrelevant. That speed unsettled them more than any argument ever could. They wanted to explain themselves, to rewrite the story, to control the narrative. But you didn't stay long enough to hear it. You understood that explanations don't change patterns, and patterns were already clear. They stood there with words loaded on their tongue, ready to defend, justify, manipulate. You didn't give them a stage. You didn't give them time. You simply exited the scene. They thought you would need answers to heal. They didn't realize clarity had already arrived. When clarity shows up, questions disappear. They wanted to scream because screaming is a last attempt at power, but you had already reclaimed yours by choosing momentum over meaning. They were still emotionally unpacking the situation while you were already closing the door. That difference in timing made them feel foolish and exposed. They thought the bond meant you'd hesitate, that you'd slow down, that you'd look back, but you moved forward without dragging the past behind you. They wanted to see pain in your eyes. Instead, they saw decision, calm, resolve, and that terrified them. They wanted to argue about what went wrong. You understood what went wrong the moment respect left the room. No discussion required. They believed you would need closure from them. They didn't realize closure is something you give yourself when you stop expecting decency from people who've already shown you who they are. They wanted to scream why because they couldn't accept how easily you let go. But letting go wasn't easy, it was necessary. They were still emotionally stuck in the moment they lost control. You had already mentally stepped into the next chapter. They wanted to negotiate feelings. You were already renegotiating your standards upward. They expected nostalgia to slow you down, memories to soften you, but memories don't outweigh self-respect once it finally wakes up. They tried to pull you back into conversation, into emotion, into unfinished business. You denied them all of it with a single choice: forward. They were still searching for reasons. You were already searching for better. They wanted your attention, even if it came in the form of anger, but you didn't even give them that courtesy. They mistook your silence for shock. It wasn't shock, it was certainty. They wanted to scream because they felt discarded. You didn't discard them emotionally. You simply stopped carrying what no longer belonged to you. They were desperate for a reaction that would confirm they mattered. But indifference is the loudest confirmation that someone no longer does. They stayed behind asking why me, while you moved on asking what's next. They thought endings had to be dramatic to be real. You proved that the most final endings are the quiet ones. They wanted closure through conversation. You chose closure through action. They were still processing the loss. You had already accepted the lesson. They expected you to break stride. You didn't even slow your pace. They wanted to scream because they felt powerless, and they were right the moment you said next. Their power disappeared. They tried to haunt your thoughts, but your mind was already occupied with growth, direction, and distance. They couldn't believe how quickly you replaced confusion with clarity, pain with progress, attachment with discipline. They wanted a dramatic goodbye. You gave them a silent departure. They wanted you to look back one last time. You didn't. Because looking back would have been a waste of momentum. They stayed behind with questions echoing in their chest. You walked forward with answers you no longer needed to explain. They wanted to scream why to keep you emotionally tied. But you whispered next. And in that single word, you chose time, power, and self-respect over a conversation that no longer deserved you. They weren't ready for how little time you gave them to matter after everything they did. They expected delays, emotional traffic, a long goodbye. But you treated time like currency and refused to spend another second on something already bankrupt. They wanted your pause, your hesitation, your doubt, because doubt is where influence lives. But you didn't pause long enough for them to step back in. They stood there rehearsing explanations while you were already walking away. Their words expired before they ever reached your ears. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing you wrestle with the decision. Instead, you moved like the decision had been made long ago because it had. They thought your silence meant you were overwhelmed. In truth, silence meant you were finished processing. There was nothing left to discuss. They wanted to scream why because why would make them feel important. But you no longer measured importance by history, only by alignment. They weren't prepared for how unemotional your exit was. Not cold out of cruelty, but cold out of clarity. Clarity doesn't linger. They tried to slow you down with memories, inside jokes, old promises. But nostalgia doesn't work on someone who has outgrown the past. They wanted you to stumble one last time, just to prove you were human. But growth sometimes looks ruthless to people who stay the same. They couldn't accept that you didn't need their explanation to validate your experience. You trusted what you saw, not what they said. They thought you'd collapse before moving on. Instead, you reorganized your life like they were never meant to be permanent furniture. They wanted emotional mess because mess keeps doors open. You chose clean lines and closed doors. They asked questions out loud. You answered them privately and moved forward. They didn't realize how long it takes someone to say next without bitterness. That word doesn't come from impulse, it comes from exhaustion meeting self-respect. They wanted to stay relevant through confusion, but you replaced confusion with direction. They expected you to circle back eventually, to miss them loudly, to regret quietly. But you never circled back, you elevated. They were still unpacking emotions while you were packing lessons. They wanted your healing to involve them. You healed by removing them. They tried to make you feel heartless. But heartless people don't love deeply first. You did, and that's why your ending was so clean. They mistook your quick exit for lack of depth. But only deep people know when to leave without dragging damage behind them. They stayed stuck in the moment things fell apart. You treated that moment as a checkpoint, not a destination. They wanted time to explain themselves into a better ending. You understood endings aren't negotiated after disrespect. They thought, why would haunt you? But next liberated you. They wanted closure through conversation. You chose closure through movement. They are still standing where you left them, wondering how it ended so fast. They didn't expect how settled you looked after leaving. Not rushed, not shaken, not unsure. Settled like someone who finally stopped carrying unnecessary weight. They wanted your departure to look impulsive so they could dismiss it later. But it wasn't impulsive, it was precise. and precision leaves no room for return. They kept waiting for regret to show up on your face. Days passed, silence stretched. Regret never came. That absence disturbed them more than anger ever could. They thought time would soften you. That distance would make you nostalgic. Instead, distance made you sharper and more certain. They wanted you to feel the loss loudly, but you processed it quietly, internally, efficiently, like something already resolved. They couldn't understand how someone could leave without needing validation. They don't know what it's like to trust your own judgment completely. They expected you to look back just once, to hesitate at the door, but you closed it with the same calm you used to open your next chapter. They wanted you to suffer visibly so they could feel forgiven indirectly, but your peace denied them that comfort. They mistook your quick transition for emotional numbness. In reality, it was emotional mastery. They stayed, hoping for a delayed reaction, a message, a question, a crack. None came. They realized too late that next wasn't dismissal, it was selection. You chose yourself without ceremony. They wanted to remain a reference point in your life. Instead, they became a lesson you no longer revisit. They thought endings had to echo, but yours landed clean and silent, leaving nothing to debate. They are still trying to process what happened. You've already integrated it and moved forward. And the hardest truth for them is this: you didn't leave angrily, you didn't leave broken, you didn't leave confused. You left ready. They feel foolish because the game they designed so carefully ended with them trapped by their own moves. They thought they were clever, manipulating from the shadows, but they never realized you were watching the board the entire time. They believed you were reacting emotionally while they were thinking strategically. What they didn't know was that you were doing both, feeling nothing while calculating everything. That combination made you dangerous. They thought they were leading you, but they were only revealing themselves. Every lie, every delay, every half-truth became another predictable move. And predictable players always lose. They feel stupid now because you never interrupted their performance. You let them talk, scheme, and overplay their hand. You understood that the fastest way to win is to let your opponent think they're in control. They assumed you were naive because you stayed calm. They mistook patience for blindness. But patience is exactly what allowed you to see the entire pattern while they focused on short-term wins. They feel embarrassed, realizing you never confronted them because you didn't need to. Confrontation would have ended the game too early. You wanted the full picture before delivering the final move. They thought they were manipulating emotions. What they didn't realize is that you had already detached, and manipulating someone who doesn't care is like throwing punches at air. They feel foolish because they celebrated victories that didn't exist. They mistook your silence as submission, your distance as confusion. In reality, you were already planning your exit. They underestimated how observant you were. You noticed tone shifts, inconsistencies, timing gaps. While they focused on deception, you focused on behavior. They feel stupid because you never rushed your decision. You let them reveal their intentions naturally. People always expose themselves when they think they're winning. They thought they were smarter because they talked more. You proved intelligence doesn't need an audience. You listened, processed, and waited. They feel humiliated, knowing you saw through the game long before it ended. You weren't figuring things out at the end, you were confirming what you already knew. They expected an emotional breakdown. Instead, they got a clean checkmate. No yelling, no chaos. Just one final move that ended everything instantly. They feel foolish because they tried to play psychological games with someone who mastered emotional control. And emotional control beats manipulation every time. They thought they could outthink you because you didn't argue. But arguing was never the goal. Winning was. They feel exposed because once you walked away, the entire illusion collapsed. Without you participating, their game had no meaning. They didn't realize that by lying they were giving you leverage. Every contradiction became proof. Every excuse became confirmation. They feel stupid because you never accuse them, you let their actions convict them. That's the cleanest checkmate there is. They thought they were ahead because they had information. They didn't realize you had awareness. Awareness always wins. They feel foolish now, replaying conversations, realizing how obvious they were. The signs they thought you missed were the ones you noted first. They underestimated your self-control. They thought emotions ruled you, but you had already separated emotion from decision. They feel embarrassed because the moment you left, they understood they never had power. You allowed them to think they did. They tried to flip the narrative, but it didn't work. You didn't respond. And without reaction, manipulation dies instantly. They feel like amateurs because you never showed your hand. You let them expose theirs completely before moving. They thought they were smart because they planned. You were smarter because you waited. They feel foolish because you never tried to beat them at their own pace. You slowed the game down until their impatience betrayed them. They believed they were setting traps. In reality, they were walking straight into one. They feel stupid because you didn't chase answers. You waited for behavior to answer everything. They thought silence meant weakness. They learned silence can be strategy. They feel embarrassed because when the final move came, it was irreversible. No appeal, no negotiation. They underestimated how well you understood human patterns. You didn't guess, you recognized. They feel foolish because you didn't need revenge. The loss itself was punishment enough. They thought you were emotionally invested in the outcome. You were invested in clarity. They feel humiliated knowing you let them play the entire game, knowing exactly how it would end. They thought they were writing the story. You simply turned the page and ended it. They feel stupid because the checkmate didn't look dramatic. It looked quiet, calm, and final. They underestimated the danger of someone who stays composed while being underestimated. They feel foolish because the moment they realized the truth, it was already too late. They lost not because you cheated, but because you understood the game better than they ever did. And that's the part they can't escape. They weren't beaten by force. They were defeated by intelligence, patience, and a mind they never saw coming. They replay every move now, trying to locate where it all went wrong. But the truth is cruelly simple. It went wrong the moment they assumed you were stupid. Underestimation was the first mistake, and everything after that was just them digging deeper. They feel foolish because you never rushed the game. You never tried to outplay them loudly. You let them believe they were winning while you calmly mapped the end. Nothing humiliates a strategist more than realizing the opponent was never panicking. They can't stop thinking about how confident they were, how smug, how sure they felt, pulling strings they believed you couldn't see. That confidence now feels like self-inflicted embarrassment. They thought manipulation required intelligence. You proved it only requires someone else's ignorance, and you were never ignorant. You were observant, patient, and emotionally disciplined. They feel stupid because you didn't react when they expected you to. Their tricks depended on provoking emotion. When emotion never came, their tactics collapsed under their own weight. They assumed silence meant confusion. They didn't realize silence was calculation. You were counting every inconsistency, every contradiction, every delay. They feel exposed, knowing you let them talk themselves into defeat. You didn't interrupt their lies because lies expand when left alone. You let them build the case against themselves. They thought you were behind because you asked fewer questions. But questions weren't needed. Patterns were already speaking loudly. They feel foolish because the moment you left, everything became clear. The game only worked as long as you participated. Once you withdrew, their strategy had no opponent. They underestimated your emotional restraint. They believed you'd snap, confront, or plead. Instead, you remained composed. which robbed them of every advantage they thought they had. They feel embarrassed because you never raised your voice, never accused, never begged for honesty. You simply watched them reveal who they were. They thought intelligence meant planning moves. You showed them intelligence also means knowing when to stop playing. They feel stupid because your final move didn't look like revenge, it looked like self-respect, and that kind of ending can't be argued with. They underestimated how dangerous patience can be. While they were rushing to control outcomes, you were waiting for certainty. They feel foolish realizing you knew the ending long before they did. You stayed only long enough to confirm it wasn't salvageable. They tried to regain control with explanations and apologies. But once the board is flipped, no move can save the losing side. They feel exposed because you didn't need proof to win. Their behavior was proof enough. They thought they were playing mind games. They didn't realize you were studying psychology. They feel stupid because you never needed to trap them, you let them trap themselves. They underestimated how deeply you understood human behavior. You didn't guess motives, you recognized patterns. They feel humiliated knowing you let them believe they were clever until the very last second. That realization will sting longer than any argument ever could. They thought they'd get a dramatic ending. Instead, they got silence, and silence confirmed defeat. They feel foolish because when they finally saw the truth, there was no way back. The game was already over. They lost because they played against someone who didn't need to win loudly, only decisively. The moment you recognized disloyalty, something in you switched permanently. It wasn't anger, it wasn't heartbreak, it was clarity. You saw their actions the way an investor sees a bad asset, and once that realization hit, there was no emotional debate left to have. You didn't spiral trying to understand why they betrayed you. You simply understood that loyalty was a return they were never capable of providing. And once you saw that, continuing to invest in them felt like intentional self-sabotage. They thought disloyalty would wound you. Instead, it educated you. It showed you exactly who they were, stripped of promises and performance. And once you see the numbers don't add up, you don't pour more into a sinking account. You didn't confront them with drama or accusations. You confronted reality. You realized that trust was the capital, and they had burned through it recklessly. There was nothing left to grow from, only losses waiting to multiply. They expected you to react emotionally, to fight for something already compromised. But you don't fight to save something that proved it doesn't respect your value. You cut losses quietly and moved on with discipline. From that moment on, you never looked at them the same. The admiration died. The benefit of the doubt expired. The image you held of them collapsed under the weight of their own choices. And once an image shatters, it never reforms the same way. You stopped romanticizing their intentions. You stopped justifying their behavior. You stopped pretending potential mattered more than patterns. Disloyalty turned them into a liability in your eyes, not a loss. They didn't realize how final that internal shift was. They thought they could recover your trust with words, apologies, or time. But trust isn't rebuilt once it's treated carelessly. It's reassessed and redirected elsewhere. You began to see how much emotional energy you wasted maintaining something that gave diminishing returns. The imbalance became obvious. You were investing loyalty, patience, and consistency into someone offering excuses and convenience. That realization didn't hurt, it sobered you. You understood that attachment without respect is just emotional debt, and you refused to stay in a position where you were the only one paying. They noticed the distance but misunderstood it. They thought you were upset. They didn't realize you were done evaluating them as a long-term presence in your life. You had already made the decision internally. Once disloyalty entered the picture, they were no longer a priority. They became an example of what happens when someone underestimates the consequences of breaking trust with the wrong person. You didn't need revenge, you didn't need closure. The data was enough. Their actions spoke clearly, and you listened with maturity instead of emotion. You stopped offering access, stopped offering explanations, stopped offering chances. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. You don't reopen failed investments hoping for miracles. They tried to act like nothing had changed, but everything had. You were present physically, but mentally detached. Your loyalty was already reallocated to yourself. What shocked them most was how calm you became. No arguing, no accusations, no emotional breakdown. Just a quiet withdrawal that spoke louder than confrontation ever could. They underestimated how observant you were. They didn't realize you were taking mental notes the entire time. Disloyalty wasn't a surprise, it was the confirmation. Once confirmed, you closed the account. No overdraft, no extensions, no renegotiation. Just a clean exit with dignity intact. You began to see them clearly, without attachment, without fantasy, without excuses. And clarity changes everything. It removes hope where hope is dangerous. They wanted forgiveness. You chose discernment, because forgiveness doesn't mean continued access, and you were done confusing the two. Your standards rose the moment they failed to meet them. You realized loyalty wasn't rare, it was just incompatible with people like them. You never looked up to them again, not because you hated them, but because respect once lost doesn't regenerate. You can't admire what proved itself unreliable. They felt the shift immediately. The warmth disappeared. The effort stopped. The door remained open physically but locked emotionally. They mistook your silence for weakness, but silence was your decision, not your confusion. You had already moved past them mentally. You began investing your energy elsewhere, into peace, growth, discipline, and self-respect. And compared to that, they felt small, noisy, and draining. They couldn't understand how quickly you moved on. But you didn't move on quickly, you moved on decisively. There's a difference. Disloyalty disqualified them from your future. And you don't revisit disqualified options, no matter how familiar they feel. They still hoped you'd see them the way you once did. But once the illusion breaks, it never reforms. You don't unsee betrayal. You became colder, not cruel, sharper, not bitter, selective, not closed. Disloyalty refined you instead of ruining you. They lost access not because you were angry, but because you were intelligent enough to protect your value. You didn't look back because looking back benefits failed investments, not disciplined minds. They became a lesson, not a loss. A reminder that loyalty is the minimum, not the bonus. And the moment you accepted that truth, you never looked at them or anyone like them the same ever again. After you labeled their disloyalty for what it was, you stopped assigning them emotional value. They were no longer someone to protect, impress, or explain yourself to. They became a closed chapter that didn't deserve further analysis. You didn't announce your withdrawal. You didn't threaten to leave. You simply reduced your presence until there was nothing left to take. That quiet exit hit harder than any confrontation because it offered no chance for control. They sensed the shift immediately. The way you spoke changed. The way you listened changed. The way you cared vanished without drama. And that absence of effort told them everything they needed to know. You stopped correcting their behavior. Once you stop correcting someone, it means you've stopped seeing them as part of your future. That's when disloyalty becomes irreversible. They thought loyalty could be negotiated after the fact. But loyalty isn't something you renegotiate, it's something you either honor or lose access to forever. You began treating them like background noise, cordial but distant, polite but unreachable. You didn't owe them hostility, indifference was enough. They tried to revive old memories, old jokes, old emotional leverage. But nostalgia has no power once trust has expired. You don't invest in the past when the future demands better choices. You stopped defending your decision because you didn't need approval. You understood that people who benefited from your loyalty would never support your boundaries. They felt the downgrade instantly. From priority to option, from insider to outsider, from trusted to tolerated, and they couldn't handle how fast it happened. You didn't feel the need to prove you were right. Their behavior kept proving you right on its own. You simply stepped aside and let reality finish the conversation. They mistook your calm for forgiveness. But forgiveness never meant access again. It meant peace for you, not comfort for them. You stopped explaining your standards because you realized people who respect you don't need explanations. Those who don't will argue no matter how clear you are. Disloyalty taught you discernment. It sharpened your instincts. It trained you to notice energy shifts before words change. You evolved because of it. They were shocked by how easily you adjusted to life without them. But once trust is gone, attachment dissolves faster than people expect. You didn't replace them immediately. You replaced the space they occupied with self-respect, and that upgrade made their absence irrelevant. They realized too late that loyalty was the one thing you never compromised on. You could forgive mistakes, flaws, even distance, but not betrayal. You never raised your voice. You never exposed them. You never chased accountability. You let their actions close the door permanently. You stopped wondering what could have been. Once disloyalty enters the picture, what could have been becomes a waste of mental energy. They couldn't accept that you moved on without anger. But anger still cares. Indifference means you've outgrown the situation entirely. You treated the ending like a financial decision, no emotion, no nostalgia, just risk assessment and exit. That mindset protected your future. They are now forced to live with the consequence of being downgraded by someone they underestimated. And that consequence is permanent.